Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today we're diving into the JFK assassination, but with a bit of a twist. We're really going to be focusing on Clay Shaw, a figure who sort of emerged, later in all the investigations. And our main source for all of this is a British research journal called Dealey Plaza Echo. It's really packed with all sorts of fascinating stuff about JFK.
Yeah, and we actually have two articles from the journal to work with today, Memories of Clay Shaw and The Single Bullet in Flatland. They're really an interesting mix. We've got these sort of personal accounts and then some pretty hardcore analysis.
Yeah.
We can really explore both the human side of things and then dig into some of the evidence.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you listening have heard of the single bullet theory, but today we're going to kind of go beyond that.
Yeah.
We're going to really look into Clay Shaw's background and try to understand how he might be connected to what happened in Dallas. I think you guys are going to be surprised by some of this stuff.
And to really get Shaw, it's important to remember that his later life in New Orleans, it was intertwined with people like Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry. It's a whole web of connections.
Okay, so let's start with Shaw's time in England. During World War II, he was stationed with the 127th Army General Hospital Unit at Sandhill Park in Somerset. And we have this incredible first-hand account from Jack Holman. He was a surgical technician who served with Shaw.
Oh, wow. Holman's perspective is really fascinating because it gives us this kind of glimpse into Shaw's personality, outside of the whole assassination context. He talks about Shaw checking the barracks, even sitting on his bunk, and asking Holman to sing. Little details like that, I mean, they really paint a picture.
It does, right? It really humanizes him in a way. Holman even suspected that Shaw might have been gay, but he makes it clear that Shaw never made a pass at him. He described Shaw as, pleasant, conversational, someone he enjoyed spending time with.
It's interesting. Holman even said that he thought Shaw being involved in the assassination, it would be completely out of character for him. Of course, you have to take these personal recollections with a grain of salt, especially when you're talking about events from decades ago.
Yeah.
But it's still, an important piece of the puzzle.
For sure. It definitely adds another layer. And speaking of mysteries, Sandhill Park itself has a pretty interesting history. It was a grand estate, then it was a children's hospital, and then later a fire museum, and then eventually abandoned.
Oh, wow. You know that. And the article even mentions some reports of spooky happenings at Sandhill, doors slamming, whispers, just a kind of unsettling feeling, obviously not directly related to Shaw or anything, but it adds a certain eeriness to the whole setting.
Right, like straight out of a ghost story. But let's move on from England for now.
Yeah.
And dig into Shaw's possible involvement
with intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
After the war. This is where things get really interesting. Yeah, this good stuff. So the article kind of gets into this debate about whether Shaw was involved with the OSS. It cites some conflicting sources on that, but it does confirm that he was involved with the Army's Special Operations Section, the SOS, which was a counterintelligence group. So that suggests a deeper connection to espionage.
Okay, so that's pretty significant, especially when you consider that later on he became the managing director of the International Trade Mart in New Orleans. I mean, it's all about international affairs, right?
It is. And it sets the stage for everything that happens later in New Orleans, a city known for its global connections.
Yeah.
And its air of mystery.
Right, exactly. Okay, so before we get into all the New Orleans stuff, let's switch gears for a minute and look at our second article for today, The Single Bullet in Flatland. This one takes a totally fresh look at the single bullet theory, which, as we all know, is a really critical piece of evidence in the JFK assassination.
Right. It's one of the most debated aspects of the whole case. And the author, Elric Rosman, he gives this really detailed analysis of the bullet's trajectory across the car, focusing on the last 2% of this journey, from Kennedy to Connally.
So it's not just about whether the bullet could travel that path, but about whether the evidence actually supports it.
Exactly. And Rosman uses Dale Meyer's digital simulation as a starting point, which a lot of people consider to be the most comprehensive reconstruction of the assassination. But he also points out some flaws in Meyer's model.
Oh, interesting. What kind of flaws?
Well, he introduces this idea of flatland analysis, which basically means looking at the bullet's path from a top-down perspective.
Yeah.
And he argues that when you do that, the trajectory actually contradicts the single bullet theory.
So he's saying that the evidence doesn't support the single bullet theory.
He is. He even goes as far as to say that the FBI was right in their initial assessment, that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the back didn't exit through his throat. And that really challenges the Warren Commission's findings.
Wow. Okay. So we've got a lot to unpack here. We've got Shaw in England. We've got his potential intelligence connections. And now this challenge to the single bullet theory. Where do we go from here?
Well, now we need to connect all of these threads. Think about Holman's take on Shaw's personality. Think about the doubts we've just raised about the single bullet theory. And then factor in Shaw's life in New Orleans, where he crossed paths with people like Oswald and Ferry, which ultimately led to Jim Garrison's investigation. It's a complicated story, but we're going to dive even deeper after the break.
All right, so we're in New Orleans now in the 1960s, a city known for its, vibrant culture. And its political undercurrents. Some might even say its covert operations.
It was a wild time for sure, and it's in New Orleans. That Clay Shaw's story really intersects with some of the key players in the JFK assassination. Our articles take us to his home, 1313 Dauphine Street in the French Quarter. It's described as this beautiful carriage house with a distinctive red door.
I love these little details. They really bring the story to life. And it's interesting because when Shaw was arrested in 1967, the police searched his house, and they found some, shall we say, intriguing items.
Oh, yeah. The whips and chains. And that black hood. Not exactly what you'd expect to find in your average home.
Right. Shaw's friend said it was all just for Mardi Gras costumes, which, in New Orleans isn't that far-fetched.
Yeah, I mean, it's Mardi Gras. Anything goes right.
Exactly. But what's really fascinating is how close Shaw's house was to other figures connected to the assassination.
Yeah, the article points out that James Llewellyn, who had shared an apartment with David Ferry at one point, lived right next door to Shaw, at 1309 Dauphine Street.
And not only that, but Dante Maricini, another Ferry associate, also lived with Llewellyn.
Well, hold on. That's a little too close for comfort to just be a coincidence, right?
It's definitely a connection that investigators couldn't ignore. And it gets even more interesting, because the article mentions a meeting at Shaw's home in the summer of 1963, where Lee Harvey Oswald was allegedly present. Wait, Oswald was at Shaw's house?
That's what Perry Russo claimed. He was a key witness in Jim Garrison's investigation. He said the meeting included Oswald, David Ferry, and a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles.
Wow. If that's true, that meeting could link Shaw directly to Oswald and the anti-Castro Cuban movement, which was, a huge thing in New Orleans at the time.
It's a big if, though. Russo's testimony is definitely controversial. Some people see him as credible. Others think he was coerced or influenced by Garrison.
Yeah, that's fair. It's important to consider all sides. But even with those questions, the fact that Russo placed Oswald at a meeting in Shaw's home, it's pretty significant.
Absolutely. And the article also points out that Shaw was instrumental in developing the International Trade Mart, which promoted trade with Latin America.
Right, so we're seeing that international connection again.
Exactly. Shaw wasn't just some art enthusiast. He was a well-connected businessman with ties to a region that was deeply involved in Cold War politics.
Okay, so let's recap for a second. We've got Shaw, potentially with intelligence connections, living next door to associates of David Ferry, possibly hosting a meeting with Oswald and Cuban exiles, and deeply involved in international trade. Are you starting to see the connections here?
The dots are definitely starting to connect. But wait, there's more. The article goes on to talk about this guy named Kerry Thornley. He was an acquaintance of Lee Harvey Oswald's from their time in the Marines.
Thornley, wasn't he the one who wrote that novel that kind of foreshadowed the assassination?
Yes. The novel's called A Right-Wing Commie, and it features a character named Lee Harvey Oswald, who gets involved in a plot to assassinate a politician. It's a pretty bizarre coincidence.
That's an understatement.
Right.
So Thornley ends up in New Orleans, too.
He does. In 1963, he was living in an apartment at 1824 Dauphine Street, just a short walk from Shaw's house. And the article suggests that Thornley might have even visited a gay bar that Shaw frequented, although there's no hard evidence to confirm that.
This is like a real-life spy thriller. We've got Oswald's former Marine buddy, who wrote a fictional account of Oswald as an assassin, living near Clay Shaw, who's already connected to Oswald through Russo's testimony.
It's a lot to take in.
I know.
And just when you think it can't get any weirder, the article mentions Jack Ruby, the guy who shot Oswald. He had ties to New Orleans, too.
No way. Jack Ruby. What was he doing in New Orleans?
Well, in June of 1963, he traveled to New Orleans with a performer named Beverly Oliver. They were scouting talent for Ruby's nightclub in Dallas, the Carousel Club. They were specifically interested in a dancer named Janet Adams Conforto, who went by the stage name Gilda.
So we've got Ruby, Oswald, and Shaw all connected to New Orleans within just a few months of the assassination.
It's definitely a pattern, and we're just scratching the surface here. There's so much more information in these articles. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, you need to circle back to the single bullet theory and what it all means for Clay Shaw.
Okay, so we've uncovered all these connections, but we can't forget that Clay Shaw was actually acquitted of all the conspiracy charges.
Right, the jury didn't find enough evidence to convict him.
But an acquittal, it doesn't necessarily mean innocence, does it?
No, it doesn't. And it certainly doesn't answer all the questions we've raised.
It doesn't tie everything up in a neat little bow. It's not a simple case of not guilty equals case closed.
Not at all. The JFK assassination is just, it's so complex. There's so much information, so many conflicting accounts.
And so many what-ifs, right?
Exactly. You always come back to those what-ifs.
What if the single bullet theory isn't as solid as everyone thinks? What if Shaw being in New Orleans at the same time as Oswald and Ferry wasn't just a coincidence?
What if?
Yeah.
It's enough to make your head spin.
So we've laid out the facts, as we found them in these articles. Shaw's background, the disputed testimonies, those connections in New Orleans. But we're not here to tell you what to think.
No, our goal is to give you the information, the different perspectives, and let you come to your own conclusions.
We want to empower you to think critically about this case.
Because it's a case that demands critical thinking. It's a case that deserves to be questioned.
And I think we've shown that there's more to the story than just the official narrative.
Right, we didn't uncover some smoking gun.
Yeah.
But we definitely raised some serious questions.
And we looked at some alternative explanations that challenge the conventional way of thinking about the assassination.
And that's what these deep dives are all about. Getting you to think, to explore, to question.
The JFK assassination is such a perfect example of how history is rarely black and white.
It's full of gray areas and unanswered questions and different interpretations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into Clay Shaw and the JFK assassination, we want to leave you with this.
Don't be afraid to question the official narrative.
Do your own research, explore different viewpoints, and most importantly, keep asking questions.
Because sometimes the most fascinating discoveries come from the most unexpected places.
So until next time, keep those minds curious and keep searching for the truth